Hello, I'm Kaiser, and welcome to Moose Reads. Before I get started, I want to say that the opinions that I give here are my own opinions. They are extremely subjective. If I dislike a book, it is not a reflection on the author, and it is not a reflection on people who do like it. Different people have different tastes, and that's okay. Today, I will be reviewing And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. It's a mystery. The description says, 10 people, each with something to hide and something to fear, are invited to an isolated mansion on Soldier Island by a host who, surprisingly, fails to appear. On the island, they are cut off from everything but each other and the inescapable shadows of their own past lives. One by one, the guests share the darkest secrets of their wicked pasts, and one by one they die. Which among them is the killer, and will any of them survive? I've been having a lot of trouble with mysteries. I feel like I should say that up front. I've read 3 mystery thrillers in the last couple of years that all had the same ending. It was a perfectly fine ending, once or twice, but when it's every mystery thriller I read, it becomes obnoxious. And then I read 2 mysteries this year for my book club, and I didn't like either one. I like watching mysteries. I often watch and enjoy crime shows, but I was starting to think that maybe I just don't enjoy reading mysteries. So I decided to read an Agatha Christie novel as a test. She's the queen of mystery, so I figured if I didn't like her books, I probably don't like mystery. I picked And Then There Were None specifically for several reasons. First, it's a standalone. I know Agatha Christie has at least 2 series, Miss Marple and Poirot, and I didn't want to read a book from either of those. Additionally, I'd heard of And Then There Were None, but I didn't know how it ended. Since I'd heard of it, I thought it was probably one of her more popular books, and since I didn't know the ending, or really anything about it, I could enjoy it without the baggage of expectation or spoilers. And then, just to make sure it was a good choice, I watched a video by someone who really likes Agatha Christie, books like Woe, who had a video attempting to objectively rank Christie's novels and placed And Then There Were None at number 1. All in all, it seemed like a good choice. It was not. I gave this 3 stars. I did not like this book, and that is entirely down to the ending. Up until the end, it was a perfectly serviceable mystery. I wasn't blown away by either the characters or the murders, but it did keep my attention. But the ending was extremely disappointing for me. I want to talk a bit about the political issues surrounding the book. If you don't know, this book was not originally called And Then There Were None. I will not say the original title because it contains a slur that has no business coming out of my mouth. The name was changed when it was published in America. I think the UK eventually adopted the title as well, though seemingly not for a very long time. And at some point they basically did a find and replace to swap the word out for soldier. Generally, I'm all for this kind of change, with very specific conditions. Racism is bad. That should be obvious, but I'll say it just so we're clear. I don't have a problem with removing racism from a book, especially if, like in this case, changing the one word has absolutely no impact on anything in the story. But I think this needs to be done either with the author's express permission, or it needs to be very clearly stated before the start of the book that these are not the author's original words and that these changes were made. Honestly, even with the author's permission, I think it should probably be stated. It was not stated in this book, at least not in my copy. The name change did happen within Christie's lifetime, so I'll give her and the publisher the benefit of the doubt that she approved it. But even allowing for the fact that Christie might have approved the change, it uses what was apparently a minstrel song from 1869 as a plot device and includes that in its entirety changed for consistency. So even if Christie approved the changes and we therefore agree to let her off the hook for her racism, which we probably shouldn't, the author of the song could not. And he was credited by name in the copy I read. And the issue isn't really about respecting the author. That guy deserves no respect. But I will admit that part of my issue is that, as an aspiring author, I'm not comfortable with the idea of attributing words to an author that aren't theirs. But really the issue is with absolving the author. If I read "and then there were none" with no additional context, I don't understand how hateful and how hurtful both the song and the book were. And, incidentally, I kind of did. When I read it, it said on the cover that it was previously published under the title 10 Little Indians, which I had heard before and which I believed was the original title. Looking it up before discussing this was a hell of an education. Anyway, that aside, let's talk about why I didn't like the ending. From here on out, there will be spoilers. If you don't want to hear spoilers for this book, please close the video now. For the rest of you, here's the details. Initially, this was a different kind of review. In my copy of this book, the last section had bold font and looked at a glance like an author's note or some similar. And the section before it, which was part of the epilogue, seemed like an ending. A terrible ending, but an ending. So I thought it was the end, and I was so mad that I didn't pay enough attention to realize my mistake. I looked it up before making this review to make sure I didn't miss anything. Whoops. So, the first part of the epilogue is a couple of cops discussing the murders and pronouncing themselves baffled, and thinking that was the actual ending, that we just don't know who did it, or how, or why. I was fuming. I gave this book 1 star. I was so pissed. But now I've learned, and I've properly read the end, which bumped it back up to 3 stars. So technically this is a November read. Anyway, the ending was much better than a vague shrug, but I still did enjoy it. Why? You may recall, earlier in this review, I said that I'd read 3 mystery thrillers that all had the same ending. The ending in question was that one of the people who had been killed was not actually dead, and they were the killer. Guess how this book ends? That's right, one of the murder victims wasn't actually dead, and he's the murderer. 4 of these fucking things now. I've had enough. Also, the explanation was rather uncomfortable to read. Seriously, full spoilers here, but it was the judge. And he wrote a confession and sealed it in a bottle he tossed out to sea. Setting aside the wild improbability of that being found, and the fact that it would have made just as much sense and allowed us to skip the bumbling cops bit if he had just left the confession on the table, it means that our whole whodunit explanation comes entirely from the perspective of the murderer. So we don't get any condemnation of his crimes, and it is arguably implicit that we are meant to agree with him. I'm not going to get into the morality of murdering murderers, especially since they all have varying degrees of complicity. The bigger problem for me was that the judge had absolute certainty in his ability to determine guilt. He also had absolute certainty in the righteousness and capability of the police, setting aside the one bad apple that he murdered. And in addition to him flat out saying he always knows when someone is or isn't guilty, the people he murders in this book more or less admit to the crimes to which they are accused. So it really does feel like we're supposed to believe he's right, possibly even to believe he was right to kill the people he killed. And half of the evidence that he gathered to compile his list of victims is entirely hearsay. In particular, the final victim is condemned entirely on the assertion of her former lover that he just knew that she had done it on purpose. For context, she was in love with a man named Hugo who had a nephew that stood in the way of him inheriting a fortune. She was responsible for watching the nephew. They lived on a beach, and the nephew always wanted to swim out to a rock in the distance, but he was always told it was too dangerous and he wasn't allowed. But the woman wanted to get her lover his inheritance, so one day she tells the boy she thinks he could make it, but he's still not allowed to, and then intentionally lets herself be distracted for a few minutes so that he can make an attempt. Nobody else seems to think she did it on purpose, and until the very end of the book, she never tells anyone it was anything but an accident. But Hugo knew just by looking at her, and he tells the judge this in a drunken conversation, and the judge puts her on his list. In fact, he doesn't just put her on his list. He says in his confession that he killed them in order of their guilt. So he kills the people he holds the least responsible first, and the people he holds the most responsible last, so that the people who least deserve it have to suffer the anxiety of looming death for the shortest time. So the woman that he can only condemn by his own assumptions and the assumptions of a man he met once is so guilty of her crime that she deserves to suffer the greatest amount of terror before dying. And to put this in a bit more context, the very first person he kills is a man that ran over a kid while driving recklessly, brazenly admitted to it when accused, and showed zero remorse. But according to the judge, he was born without moral capability, so he's not really guilty. A doctor who killed a patient while drunk is less guilty than her. So yeah, I didn't like this. I can, however, recognize that this is a me problem. It's also a problem of timing. And Then There Were None was written in 1939. It may well have been the first to have this kind of ending, but I read it after 3 others that were part of its legacy, and that had an impact. Not that I necessarily think it would have made a huge difference. Everything from the judge's confession was unpleasant enough that I wouldn't have liked it anyway, and the writing as a whole, while easy to read, was not especially gripping. I wouldn't recommend this one, but I'm not the right person to ask. I don't read mysteries. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please check out more in the future. Bye!